Greetings. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. Hail, conscript father. We begin with a lesson in imperialism. In these last days since we spoke, we're at our favorite wine bar by the Thames. The centurions are retired from different legios, telling wonderful stories. We'll tell one later. Wonderful stories. We have witnessed the debate over the use of the gunboat, sometimes called the B-2, by the empire that inherited our talent for using force in order to impose our will. That is Rome, and that is the United States of America. So we begin by observing, strangely to us, why it is that so many really well-educated members of the intelligentsia in the 21st century want to divide the world between liberal and illiberal, as if that somehow washes away the sins of imperialism. In our time, 91 AD, springtime, now summer, we accepted the fact that the empire kept it safe. Now and again, there was an eruption, an emperor here, an emperor there, some vengeance. But then again, we would stabilize and reestablish our authority for 1,500 years. And we were an empire and we were proud of it. So Germanicus, I come to you, conscript father, with a puzzle. I read in the Financial Times, surely the best paper representing liberal democracy in the 21st century, an essay by a renowned intellectual, Timothy Garton Nash, dividing the world into liberal and illiberal, talking about elections forthcoming, the EU becoming a power, so that there are three powers, the United States, the EU, and the Eurasian illiberals. I thought, as I listened to him, how complicated it gets for him. Whereas in our time, we are the empire, and we impose our will with force. The B-2, for example, it was a one-off demonstration of gunboat diplomacy, something the British would recognize easily. You send a gunboat in, you show that there will be no mercy, and suddenly the rebel, the revolutionary, the cruel nature of a local warlord becomes intimidated, and everybody deserts him, and we go on as an empire. That looks to be a possible outcome of Iran, although, as we said last week, this is the Parthians, this is the Persians, this is a 2,000-year, 2,500-year, 3,000-year empire itself. It's in their blood to remember that. So they're not rolling over as easily as some other country might. But in any event, the United States expressed its power with a gunboat. It used it once. It could have followed up, but it chose not to. And now we see the lessons are being taken around the world. Good heavens, what have they got? We can't stop it. Why is it, the question to you, Germanicus, the 21st century liberal thinkers want to avoid being an empire? What is it about what we have established that makes them hesitate? Good evening to you.
Good evening, Gaius. The British Empire also cavilled at being an empire, even though it had an empire within an empire called the Indian Empire, and Victoria was known as the Queen Empress. Nonetheless, Britain thought of itself as a liberal parliamentary order, and really recoiled for much of the 19th century from the idea that they were an empire like Rome, and yet they used force with incredible imperial effectiveness. And when we talk about gunboat diplomacy, it's important to know that what we're really confronting is the ability of an empire to exercise its authority without a decision by force of arms. In other words, a bloody war in which the opponent is beaten to the ground and cries out for mercy and quarter, and you have a military ending, is not always necessary, because the majesty of the empire is such that it can radiate authority, and it's instilled that authority within the breast of their opponents. And if exercised properly, a ceremonial demonstration of power done correctly can bring a potential enemy who might be ready to go to war to the peace table, and to make the necessary, sort of genuflection ritually in return. In other words, the demonstration of force, which may involve combat at a lower level, but it's always demonstrative expressions of power, actually bring an end to what would otherwise have been a war brewing. And the most famous Victorian example, which is really quite resonant to what just happened, was at the end of the Russo-Turkish War of 1878. And this war had really begun because Bulgaria had rebelled against the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans went in and were slaughtering Bulgarians, and the British referred to this as the Bulgarian horrors. Well, that's very similar to our ally Israel, and the depredations it is wreaking upon the Palestinians of Gaza. And Russia intervened, Russia, the much bigger power, who was a long-term adversary of Great Britain, just as Iran is now an adversary of the US and certainly of Israel. So when Russia stepped in to stop these horrors and to march to Constantinople, the British intervened. And how did they intervene? Well, it's very much like the B-2 and nuclear missile submarine strike just concluded. What the British did is they sent 5 capital ships. These are ironclads, but they were considered the most powerful weapon in the world in 1878. And Admiral Hornby, the commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, sailed these ironclads through the Dardanelles at night in the teeth of a blinding snowstorm. Quite a consummate act, and anchored the next day off of Constantinople in the Sea of Marmara. And the Russians were then at the gates of Constantinople, and they stopped. And they went to the peace table, a famous conference that was convened by Bismarck, the Conference of Berlin, resolved that conflict. The Russians did not want to go to war again with Great Britain the way they had in the Crimean War, where they'd been defeated. And so Britain was able to pull off a real coup here, just as Iran today really did not want to go to war with the United States. And Israel, which is very much like the Ottomans, a kind of recalcitrant ally going off on its own and engaging in heinous acts, could be also brought to heel, in the sense the capital ship as this radiant expression of imperial power was able to bring everyone to the table, because in reality, none of the parties really wanted to get into another long and bloody war. And so this is what the US was able to do just recently with its 7 Spirit bombers and their 14 magnificent magic bullets, and the Leviathan of the Deep, whichever SSGN it was, this giant submarine launching its or hurling its harpoon-like cruise missiles. It was simply enough, because it broke the spell, and it asserted the awesomeness of the US in a situation where both sides really didn't want to go to war. Israel had been pounded by the Iranians, just as the Russians had reached the gates of Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire was ready to collapse. And as I said, the Russians didn't want to have another bloody defeat at the hands of the British, just as the Iranians really don't want to get into that kind of spat with the US. So the war ended. It's a perfect example of a ceremonial intervention, which is classic gunboat diplomacy. But here it had been already done in very much the same way in 1878. Valentine's Day, 1878, as a matter of fact.
It's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy mind your soul, buddies. Savior of the nation when the troopers are. It's
Well,
what we
really.
it's what we do. It's
Right.
what I do. And let us say that we Romans appreciate presenting yourself as a fair-minded enforcer of regular order. However, Germanicus, that was a sneak attack. There was no resistance whatsoever. A totally overwhelming, effective blow,
Right.
a sword that could not be fended off.
I'm not sure it was wholly a sneak attack. I think the Iranians understood that this was coming. I think they might even have been tipped off, just as they tipped us off that they were going to strike our base in the Persian Gulf as a kind of symbolic tat for original tit. I mean, I think this was a completely ceremonial situation. And it really did save Israel, because Israel had been badly pounded by Iran. And in 12 days, it lost $15 billion in damage and expended missiles. And that they couldn't have kept that up. And of course, Iran would have been equally devastated had this all tripped into a war. So I think there was a lot of understanding going on behind the scenes. I mean, for example, if you go back to 1878, what were 5 10,000-ton ironclads armed with 38-ton muzzleloaders, firing one round every 5 seconds, going to do to the whole Russian army at the gates of Constantinople? It was an understanding that was easy to reach, and the empire was able to orchestrate it. That's when imperial authority really comes in handy. And the Romans, we Romans, have done this a fair number of times.
Let's speak of the empire by speaking of the emperor. He's had a good week, and we recognize it. Emperors have good weeks and bad weeks. The Friends of History Debating Society, I'm Gaius, Germanicus is here. We're looking at the 21st century very closely, recognizing it entirely, approving entirely, except for this odd need to pretend that you're not an empire. Odd, strange. Perhaps there's some advantage in it. Not for us, and we'll speak of how we manage the savages with our legios. I'm Gaius, John Batchelor, Michael Vlahos is Germanicus, and this is Londinium. This is the Friends of History Debating Society, live with Germanicus. I am Gaius. We are observing the 21st century because it's a fascination for us to understand what becomes of our Roman Empire. It's 91 AD here, and yet doesn't embrace it is the inheritor of our tools. One of our tools was an emperor. And we pretended the emperor was the first citizen for a while. We pretended the republic continued with a senate that had equal weight to the emperor. And then that wore out when the emperors became undisciplined, and Nero died by his own hand, well, by the hand of his servant. However, here we are at the end of the first century AD, and we're looking forward to strength in the empire again, when Domitian, who started out as a worthy inheritor of his father Vespasian and his brother Titus' skills, is turned into a brute and is made an enemy of the Senate. It won't go well. We know, however, there are emperors ahead of us who do very well, especially in the 2nd century. You can't predict what an emperor is going to be like once he inherits the authority. Mr. Trump is the emperor of the 21st century. And this last week has been a demonstration of obeisance by the European powers and to a inferential success over the Eurasian powers. Xi Jinping has not been seen for days. He might be wobbly at the top of his empire. And Vladimir Putin met with the Iranian ambassador the day after the B-2 attack and said that this is illegal, but didn't make any other demonstration of resistance, as if he appreciated that Mr. Trump was acting as the authority of the empire. Germanicus, again, this is about denialism. The emperor is mocked, the emperor is derided, the emperor is challenged. They keep using this word unconstitutional. It's a mystery to me why they use it. It's almost like a ceremony for them. In any event, he's had a very good week. I can't tell whether he's good or lucky or both. He not only rolled up the gunboat in Iran, NATO bent the knee and said 5% for all of us, 3.5% by such and such a date, 1.5% of infrastructure and cyber, everyone. Canada misbehaved momentarily and was slapped down on trade. There's said to be a deal with China. And the use of the B-2s was one-off. Now they're arguing over whether it succeeded or not. Good heavens. Gunboats succeed by showing up.
Right.
The emperor's doing extremely well. He's unhappy with how he's treated, but that is the nature of empire. Why is it that the Americans and their allies in Europe resist acknowledging that he is not a regular order, that he is not some man who consults? He's an emperor, a very strong emperor, and we Romans would appreciate it.
Yes. And of course, here in this particular issue is where America is most akin to Rome. Because Rome had been a republic, it had gotten rid of its kings. It didn't like the idea of a single person holding power for any length of time beyond 6 months. And then the republic eventually came apart, and who were the men most admired, and who was the man who was able to put everything back together when the republic fell apart? Well, first it was Caesar, and then his nephew, who became known as Augustus. And the republic, however, was still the wellspring of Roman political identity, and beyond that, the larger spiritual identity of Rome was bound up in the idea of the res publica. So it remained a republic, and Augustus was first citizen. And as you pointed out, it wasn't until well after Nero that the emperor emerged to be something larger than life. And really, it wasn't, one might suggest, until Trajan that this really began to take off. And after that, it became increasingly necessary for the figure of the emperor to be invested with more and more authority, because the emperor became, in many ways, a kind of sacred king, in the sense that he embodied, literally in his person, the health and welfare of the empire. And so the more that Rome came to look to imperial authority to preserve stability and peace and to create security, the more authority the emperor had, and the more it became necessary to build up the institution of emperor. And that is, in fact, exactly what's happened in the United States since FDR. And nothing was more prized over Rome's 15 centuries than a successful emperor, an emperor who could command, and who showed that he could transform his legitimacy that gave him the right to be emperor and make laws, could be transformed into real authority. And that authority could be wielded as majestic power. And that is, in fact, what really moves people to want to embrace the emperor, because it isn't so much that everyone loves a winner, it is that the winner projects qualities of firmness and security that you want to be a part of. So look at what Mr. Trump did with Europe. First, he told them, "Hey, you're not paying up. You're not living up to your responsibilities." And then he said, "Well, I can't take this anymore. I'm going to let you go off on your own." And they had managed at that point to scare themselves so much into a frenzy of anxiety over the imminent danger of Russia that they decided, "Hey, we better go to the emperor." And when he appeared in Europe, basically saying, "Here I am," they immediately embraced him, flocked to him, abased themselves at his feet, called him daddy, because essentially they knew that they couldn't take care of their own security. They were unwilling to do it, and plus they didn't know how. They no longer know how to fight. The European member states of NATO during the Cold War were extremely powerful, and they worked hard to prepare themselves, if necessary, for war with the Soviet Union. They still had military leaders, for example, who had fought in World War II, including German officers from the Wehrmacht who are now Bundeswehr generals. So there was a sense of continuity and a sense of confidence in Europe, all of which has managed to evaporate into nothing. So, of course, they flocked to the emperor. And of course, the emperor had holding in his hands this symbolic thunderbolts that had just been hurled in the sortie, the magnificent divine sortie against the bunkers of Iran, and that all together came together. And so the American alliance system of the Cold War has been effectively transformed into a de facto empire. The European allies, who were once titular equals, who sat as equals at the ceremonial table at NATO meetings, Supreme Command, headquarters meetings, are now simply there in the lower trestles, and the emperor is effectively on a dais. It is a remarkable transformation, and it was that way before, in the time of the Emperor Bush and the Emperor Clinton, the Emperor Obama, the Emperor Biden, but it's all of that veneer has been stripped away.
Yes, there's no pretense of a republic being of equal weight. I note that the Senate obeys, but it does have its troublesome members. I saw the news moving in the 21st century that the senator from North Carolina, I believe, will not run for re-election because he displeased the emperor. That's something we recognize.
It is. It is very Roman. I mean, it's kind of sad because you didn't expect a complete abdication of authority. And of course, it hasn't wholly been abdicated. There will be not only troublesome individual senators, but at some point, if the emperor stumbles, you will suddenly see a coalescence of opposition. Suddenly, they have found their courage, and they will go after the emperor, just as has been true of our own world.
And they'll make brilliant speeches about the Constitution.
Yes.
And that checks and balances and the Supreme Court. Brilliant speeches. We look forward to it. However, again, it's strange that they want to deny what they are. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius. We have one more note, which is the way we managed troublesome tribes on the Rhine and the Danube when we come back. This is Londinium. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium at the Thames. It's a soft summer night. We're going on to the theater afterwards and look forward to the jugglers. They're back. They do very well. The children love them during the day, and we enjoy them at night. They're funny, juggling anything, swords especially. That's a trip, the Gladys. Now, Germanicus, this is not something the 21st century wants to hear, but we'll say it anyway. We managed the tribes on the Danube and the Rhine for hundreds of years by now and again wiping out a tribe.
Right.
And I puzzle, this doesn't tell easily in English. I puzzle how it is that the 21st century doesn't recognize that what Russia and Ukraine are up to is a managing of tribes on the Danube and the Rhine. We recognize it. There would be an emperor who would say, leave no one alive, and the legio would take him seriously. The dogs would be killed as well. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. It's horror, yes. It's supposed to be horror. You're not supposed to like it. But Russia is managing a tribe. And it's sacrifices. It's losing legions to do it.
Russia has a long-standing imperial tradition, just as the U.S. does. And Russia's goes back to Rome as well. What had been, by the end, a Roman Empire centered solely on Constantinople, but nonetheless, the inheritance of Rome, the East, has gone to Russia, and Russia handles what they call the near abroad, much the way Romans do. And we, in a sense, are using Ukraine the way Romans would use friendly tribes to go after other tribes. And I think I mentioned at one point what the Romans did when they were threatened by the Pechenegs is they made an alliance with the Cumans. This was in around 1097. And also, I think the point needs to be made about Rome and the US especially, less so now Russia, which has only one real theater to contend with, and that's Europe, although it does have the Caucasus and Central Asia to much lesser extent. But the US, like Rome, has two major fronts it has to deal with. Rome had the so-called barbarian tribes along the Rhine and Danube, and then it had the mighty Persian Empire, whether Parthians or Sasanians. And Rome often had to deal with a dual contingency, or as we would call it today, a two-front war. And they managed that pretty well. But there were two very, very frightening moments in Rome's history where it had to manage a three-front war. One of those was in the 3rd century, where you had Goths and Germanic tribes break through the Danube and the Rhine together. And you also had the Sasanians defeat and capture a Roman Empire. We talked about Shapur. And in the Danube Rhine frontier, the Roman Emperor Decius was killed in battle, just as the Roman Emperor of Valerian was captured and most likely executed by Shapur. That was a very bad moment. Rome came apart. And then the second moment, in which Rome almost came apart, was after 1071 and culminating again in what I just mentioned, where you had the Pechenegs raging down from the Danube. You had the Seljuk Turks who'd overrun all of Asia Minor and were right across from Constantinople on the other side of the Bosporus. And you had these truly raging Norman descendants of Vikings marching on Rome across Greece. And somehow Rome survived, but a three-front situation was the nightmare of Rome. And the two times it happened, it was almost the end. Now, we have really essentially a two-front situation now that needs to be resolved with Iran and Israel and much of the Middle East on one hand, and of course, Russia and Ukraine on the other. But we have a potential third front with Taiwan, and that would mean a horrendous situation for the U.S. And essentially, I think this is where President Trump has been remarkably aware that it is necessary not for those not to slide into a conflict, and he's made at least an outreach to Mr. Putin, the other emperor, and also he's managed to at least hold at arm's length the conflict between Israel and Iran, and this is a very shaky situation. And as for the tribal, what the Israelis call mowing the grass, the U.S. got into that after 9/11, really after 1991, and has become very much like the Romans, where we have overseen
Right.
same sort of killings in Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria.
Certainly, in Libya is every example we need to mention.
Yeah, that's hard to live down. The
Oh,
Romans did it because they felt they had to, and I guess they did. But eventually, the barbarians came into Rome, and the Romans were less successful at that point in holding them back.
Michael Vlahos is Germanicus. I am John Batchelor Gaius. The emperor had a very good week. We have no complaints. It is puzzling why the American smart set doesn't want to embrace a successful week. However, this is Londinium. We'll head on to the theater after sacrificing the god Augustus, and we'll speak again of the American Empire. Very good week for the American Empire. This is Londinium.